Yeah, so as Mia said, I'm Lukas, and I come from the Blue Fire Open Source Collective, and our we have a lot. We're making like a lot of different packages and things for the Flutter and Dart ecosystem. And today I'm going to present our most popular thing, which is called Flame. And Flame is it's the most popular game engine for Flutter. And I'm going to have a brief introduction of Flutter later, because I think some of you might not know much about it. But anyways, inside of Flutter, there's something called widgets, and Flame is just one of these Flutter widgets. And on GitHub, we have 6,000 stars now, 2,300 commits, 500 forks, and almost 100 contributors. And we've been building this for around 4 years now, but it's like in the last 2 years or so where the development have really accelerated. And this week we're going to release version 1.1. So if you're already using Flame, I recommend that you upgrade to that one. There's a lot of new, nice stuff in there. And so Flutter is a cross-platform, what do they call it again? Tool set or something. It's like a framework from Google, which makes you able to build apps quickly for all platforms, even desktop and web too. So you'll like from one code base, you can get an Android app, an iOS app, like Linux desktop, OS X desktop, Windows desktop, and web. And so that's like the real strength of Flame. You can build a game from a single code base and get it out to many different types of devices at the same time. And in Flutter, we have something called the widget tree, and it works like any other tree. Like you can have a parent that has children. It can either have one child or many children. So here you can see how our game widget, which is what we are controlling, can live inside of the Flutter widget tree. And you actually, to make a game in Flame, you actually don't have to know any Flutter at all, because you can just put your game widget as the root, and then you can do all the rest in Flame if you'd want to. But Flutter is very powerful for making like menus and navigation systems and keeping that form of state. Meanwhile, Flame is more powerful for making game logic, things like that. So it can be very good to utilize both of get the best of both worlds there. So this is basically the boilerplate code. You code in a language that is called Dart, which is the language that Flutter uses. And if you aren't familiar with Dart, but you have seen like, I don't know, Java or C# or basically any other object-oriented language, then you will understand most of the code here anyways. So this is basically all the boilerplate code that you need. You just extend our class that is called Flame Game, and you override a method called onload. And in onload, you can load your assets, and that can be like images and sounds and all those kind of things. And then you start to add something called components, which is the basic building block of the game engine. So if you don't want to use any of the other Flutter widgets or so, Flutter has something called run app, which makes you start the whole app, and then you can just put your game widget in here and create an instance of your game, and boom, you don't have to do any more Flutter than that. So similarly to Flutter, in Flame we have something called the component tree, which we call FCS, the Flame component system. And almost everything in Flame is a component, and all components have a list of children. So here you can see the game is in the root, and then you can add on components to that. And if you'd want to, you could actually even put another one of these games as a child of another component further down if you want to build something crazy. I don't know, a game with several small games in it, for example. And then a very common question is if people can use Flutter widgets inside of Flame. And like theoretically, the answer to that question is no, because inside of Flame, there are only components living, not widgets, because the update structure of widgets inside of Flutter is very different to the ones of components, which I will show you in a minute. But you can use something called the Overlays API. And with the Overlays API, you're just putting Flutter widgets on top of the game widget, which makes it possible for you to have interactive menus and stuff meanwhile your game is in the background. So if you're not familiar with game development, which I wasn't before I started developing Flame, there is a pattern called the game loop in game development. And in the game loop, you basically have two methods. One is called update and one is called render. And these ones are called in an infinite loop, 60 times per second if you want to run at 60 FPS, or like 120 if you want to run at 120 FPS. So first, the update loop is called, the update method is called, and that one updates all of the state of your components that you want to show in the next tick. And after everything has been updated, you render everything that from this updated state. And then after everything has been rendered, you go back to update again. And you see here that it gets an argument that's called DT, and that is delta time. And that's the time it took from the last update. So that you can, for example, if you would have lags or you would have a very slow phone or something, things shouldn't behave differently. So you always have to take the delta time into consideration. But many components already do this automatically in Flame. But if you're building something custom, then you have to take the DT into consideration. For example, if you want to move your player in a certain speed, then you have to multiply that speed with the delta time. So it would be like 0.0016 or something, which is in seconds and represents 60 updates per second. But if it would be lags, then that updates, the DT would be lower. And update or gestures are not handled directly in here. They are handled kind of as interrupts by Flutter. So I will show you those ones in a second. So this is what a component could look like. It has its own update and render loop that will be called automatically once it has been added to the game. So you can, if you want all your player logic code inside of a player component, you want to have that, and your enemy logic in an enemy component, or I don't know what kind of game you're building, maybe a coin if it's Mario, so that you don't have to have all the logic inside of your main game class. And here you can see how here you can have like a parent component, and then to add child components to that component, you just do add component. And this is the most basic component, and that one doesn't do anything but calling update and render. But our most common component is called position component. And then if you add children to that, they will be transformed together with that component. So say that you, for example, have your player and it picks up a weapon or something, then that weapon would be a child component of the player. And your player would walk around with that weapon without you having to care about how the weapon should be transformed on the canvas, only how it should be inside of its parent. And this is a very common mistake that people do. They create a component, and instead of adding it as a child, they call update and render manually of that component. So I'm only going to show this slide for a few seconds so people don't memorize it, but you should not do this. You should add the component as a child, and the update and render will be called automatically. If you do this, things will become very wonky later. Yeah, so the position component, as I mentioned earlier, it has 4 different properties. It's the position on the screen, or position in its parent, really, and a size, and a scale, and an angle. So the position is just, if it's added directly to the game, then it will be the absolute position it has on the screen. If it's added to a parent, it will be the parent's position on the screen plus the component's position. And the size is like how big you want the component to be. And the scale is, size and scale might seem similar, but scale is like you have the normal scale is 1, 1. So then it's not scale at all. But if you scale it up, all of the child components will also be scaled up. But if you make the size larger, all of the child components will not. And an angle is pretty self-explanatory. And also, if you want to like know if a component has moved from another component, then these ones you can listen to. You can add listeners to these ones, which can be quite useful. And these are some of the most common position components that we have. It's the sprite component, and a sprite is basically an image, but in like game dev terms. And the sprite animation component, so basically yes, an animation running. Parallax component, which you can use as a background for many games to create a like feeling of depth. Imagine, for example, if you don't know what the parallax is, and imagine that you're on a train, things that are closer to you that you're passing by, they're moving much faster, and things that are further away, they're moving slower the further away they are. So you can put several layers here on the parallax to have like mountains in the back moving really slowly, and like bushes in the front moving quite fast, which makes it, it gives it some depth. Because I didn't mention that, but Flame is a 2D only engine, because there is no support for the things that you need to make a 3D engine in Flutter yet, but they're working on it. And then we will probably introduce some 3D elements. And then we have some normal things like a text component, because you want to have like a score up in the corner maybe, or you want small speech bubbles for your characters to talk with, or yeah, you can do whatever you want. And if you just want to draw different types of geometrical shape, we have a lot of different shape components and plenty more. So here you can see a sprite component. It's just a like static little figure standing here. So that's usually not very useful for if you would want a player or something, or an enemy, or I don't know, whatever. You usually want them to move, right? So maybe a sprite component would be good for something static, like a rock in your game, or a platform, or something like that. So then we have the sprite animation component, and you can see here how it's moving, this little pixel art person. So that's one you might want to use for your players, or for just making some nice visual effects in your game. And then we have the component with the longest name in the whole game engine, sprite animation group component. And in this one, it contains several animations, and you can set different states that you want it to switch between. So here you can see, for example, that when I click this one, it will start walking. So this is quite useful for if you're making a more advanced game, because your player usually wants to do different types of animations, like if it wants to pick something up or if it wants to be running, then you can just set the state of this one and it will swap the animation quite easily. Yeah, input. So we have a lot of different input that is coming directly from Flutter, and it's like you can detect just taps on the screen, and a tap on the screen is the same as a click if you're in a browser or on desktop. Secondary, some of these ones, they only make sense on some platforms. Like secondary tap detector, for example, it's the right click on a mouse, and you don't have anything like that on a cell phone. So that one wouldn't really make sense to use if you are targeting a cell phone audience. And like double tap detector and long press detector, they're all quite easy to understand what to do. And then we have the multi-touch tap detector and the multi-touch drag detector. And they don't really make sense to have on the desktop or the browser instead. Or I guess it might work if you have a touch screen, because this one means that you can have several fingers on the screen at the same time and do different motions. So they're a little bit more advanced. And then different types of drags like that and like that. And so that is basically a simplified version of this one, as it's called a pan detector, which you can drag however you want. But this one says, I detected a vertical drag or a horizontal drag, and it had this velocity. And so if you only need the X and Y axis, then those ones are quite useful. And scaling and mouse movement detector. So that one only makes sense on web and desktop too. And scrolling. And keyboard events, of course, if you want to have your game steered by keyboard events. And so those ones, they were mixins that you put on your game class. But then we also have some helper mixins that you put on top of your components. And when you put it on the component, it only registers those events for that component if the events were on top of the component. So if I put this on a player, for example, then it will only get the tap event if it is on top of its little hitbox. And then you can implement what you want it to do if it has been tapped. And then the same with drag. If you want to drag the component around, you can override these things. And we have the same with hoverable. Right, and Flame is quite modular. It has, the core is just called Flame, and you can easily build a game with only the core. But usually you want, for example, audio in your game, and then you want to, then we have these things called bridge packages. So then you could pull in Flame audio, and that would give you helpers for playing audio in the game, like background music and sound effects and things like that. Or if you want a full-blown physics engine, we have made a port of Box 2D, which is called Forge 2D. And then you can just use the Flame Forge 2D package to do that. And if you haven't seen, the Flutter had a little hackathon now that has been going on for a few months, which was called Flutter Puzzle Hack. And I did you were only supposed to make like a little slide puzzle. It was a super simple thing. But then I used this physics engine to build this. So instead of this sliding puzzle, then all of the blocks can fall over and stuff like that. It makes it a lot harder, but it also looks very cool. And then we have Oxygen. So earlier I mentioned that we have the Flame component system, which is our own way of handling like updates and things like that. But in game development, there is something called ECS, called Entity Component System, which is a completely other way of organizing things. So we have an ECS system called Oxygen. So if you would like to use ECS instead of FCS, then you can just use Flame Oxygen. And if you want to create your own like animations and sprites, we have something called Fire Atlas, which easily makes it like you can take an image and you can create a sprite sheet from it. So you can say like this frame should be played first, and this, and this, and it should have this much time in between them, and it should loop, and all those kind of things. And there are lots of more bridge packages than these ones. And other features we have a camera and a viewport, so you can move around where you're looking in the world. And if you want your game to be, maybe your game would be a lot simpler if you had a big screen. So then you can restrict it with a viewport so everyone has the same aspect ratio that they're looking at, or the same resolution even. There are a lot of different types of viewports that you can choose from. And in the future, there will be like a circular viewport, maybe, so you only see a circle in the world and things like that. And we have built-in collision detection too, so that you can add hitboxes to your components. And that will also improve the gestures, because if you don't add any hitboxes, then the gestures will be detected only on the like square or the rectangle that is surrounding your component. But if you add hitboxes, then you can make like, okay, I want a round head and I want like polygon body or something, and then it will detect the gestures only on those ones. And then if it hits another hitbox, you will get collision detection callbacks, and you can act on the collisions. So if you are Mario and you run into a coin, you can say, okay, remove that coin and give me 1 point. Or if you eat a mushroom, you say, okay, now the player should grow. And we have the effector parent. So you can say, okay, now I want this component to do like, I want it to move up here and rotate 2 laps and then go down again. And then you just say, okay, add this rotate component and add this move by path component to, or effects to this component, and your component will do that. So it can make it very visually appealing. And there are a lot of different effects like scaling effects and yeah, the rotation effect. As I said, we have probably like 10 different types of effects. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we have different types of helpers for gesture and input handling on top of Flutter's system. And if you want to make a like really heavy game with like lots and lots of images that should be rendered, then we have support for sprite batching, which means that you take, instead of rendering all these images one by one on the canvas, you kind of batch them into one image first, and then you render that image on the canvas, which can make it a lot more efficient. And all of a sudden you can render like tens of thousands of images on the canvas at the same time, but that wouldn't be possible if you did it just sequentially by rendering them. And we have the physics engine, as I said earlier, but through Forge 2D, so that isn't inside of Flame. So the physics engine would be useful if you have several different bodies that you want to automatically act on collisions. So if you have 2 balls that bounce against each other, they should, according to the physics, bounce away. But if you just use the collision detection, they will go together and it will say, okay, now it's a collision, but you will have to act on that collision yourself. And we have a very handy built-in debug mode. So either you can set debug mode equals to true on your game, and everything will render the hitboxes and squares and positions and sizes on the screen, so you can see where the engine thinks that everything is. So if you have done something weird, you will probably spot it there. And if you don't want it can, if you have a lot of components in there, it can be a little bit too much to render everything. So then you can put it just on a component and it will render only the debug mode for that component and its children. So how do you get started with Flame? Every feature that we build has an example on examples.flameengine.org. So you can go in there and you can get some inspiration for like different things you can do. But there are no full-blown games in there. So it's just small, easy examples for how to do different things. So it's not very, a lot of the examples are not very visually appealing because they should be quite clear what's happening. So it can be, for example, just a cube moving around on the screen or things like that. And we have our documentation, of course, which is at docs.flameengine.org. And we have a short tutorial on tutorials.flameengine.org, and we're currently working on this one to make it longer. But there are plenty of unofficial community tutorials. Like there are YouTube series that are hours and hours long, and there are Medium posts that go through every feature of Flame. So, and all those. So when you get stuck with Flame, what should you do? We have a super nice community. Like, yeah, it's such a pleasure working in Flame because you get so much from the community. And yeah, we have the Discord with lots of activity, which you can join. If you go into just flameengine.org, there is a little join link there for our Discord. And if you have questions, you can just come in there and ask, and people are usually very helpful and will get you on the right track. And if you're not the chat type of person, then you can use just the Flame tag on Stack Overflow, and there will be usually be someone answering within a day or so. And if you find a bug or you have a like new feature that you would like to see in Flame, then you can just raise a GitHub issue. Or if you have a hard problem, you can also raise a GitHub issue, but it's preferred to do Stack Overflow or Discord for like when you're stuck, and just keep bugs and feature requests to the GitHub issues. Right, I think I'm gonna, sometimes I go into the example sites and show around a bit, but I think that you can just as well do that yourself. So that is, I can write the link here and you can have a look. Yeah, so do we have any questions? I saw that there was one question that was sent in before the presentation, and that was whether you could make a Super Mario game inside of Flame, and you absolutely could. That is like a perfect fit for making a Flame game. Any more questions? Particle effects, no one said. Yeah, we have some support for particle effects too, built into Flame. And there is also particle effects that are inside of Forge 2D, which also, and those particle effects also react to physics. But the particle effects is something we really would like to improve inside of the core engine. And yeah, the tutorial page seems incomplete because it is just two short steps of getting into the Flame component system. Yeah, we have, you can do multiplayer games too. There is work being done on a multiplayer game server called Coliseum. And the creator of that is building a client for Dart. And once that is done, it will be like very nice to do multiplayer games. But currently, I mean, you can just, if you don't need super high high, like real time speed, and you can, I mean, just send TCP packages or whatever. Or yeah, or have just a REST interface or something in between. Or you can set up UDP tunnels and things too and handle everything manually, but that is quite harder. Are there any big open source games created with Flame? If so, could you link to those? I wouldn't say big. Like, there are some people earning money on their games, of course, but we have a little. There is a community member has built a site with all of the like a lot of games that have been built in Flame. But on the top of my head, one popular game on Android and iOS is called Tomb Toad. That's what it's called. You can check that out on your phones if you want to. That is a really fun game. Let's see what we have more here. Level editor. No, we have basically no visual things at all except for our this Fire Atlas tool that I briefly talked about, which makes you able to edit animations and things like that. But you can use it's called Tiled, which is a tool that is not like specifically for Dart or anything, but it's used for a lot of different games where you want to just build up your game from tiles. You can use that, and we have a bridge package called Flame Tiled. So that one is quite useful. Are there some game developer teams that need another developer? You can go into our Discord, and we have a hiring channel there. And you can just write that, I'm available for work, or you can check if anyone else has posted anything interesting in there. Sometimes there are people writing there, but we just started a channel, so it's not a lot of posts in there. There was something more here. For what platform can you use with Flame? Yeah, you can iOS, Android, Windows, Linux, OS X, web, of course, and like you can even use it on some like smart TVs and things if you put some work into it. Because yeah, Flutter is built on something called Skia, which is like the rendering engine, and you can get that to work on a lot of things. But the default support for Flutter is iOS, Android, and desktop and web. All right. Any more questions? So how to move the background as per play movement? Usually you don't want to move the background per se. You want the background to be, or you can do it in a lot of different ways, but if you have a big background, you can have that one static, and then you can just have the camera can follow the player. So the camera will move when the player is moving, and then it will feel like the background is moving, if that makes sense. Any more questions? Authentication. So Flutter has a lot of different tools for that. So that's not something that is built into Flame, but Firebase, for example, has very good support for authentication. And there are some packages that gives support for what is it called again? There are like a special kind of game like services on Android and iOS, so it can just use high scores and things from there. And same with analytics, you also get that from Flutter. All right, but can I replicate the background and render it according to the player's position? Yeah, sure, you can do that. You can just listen to the player's position and render it when you feel that the next bit of the background is necessary.
Can I ask here?
Yeah, sure.
I felt strange. So thanks. Great presentation.
Thanks.
I'm curious. Like I've worked with games like many years ago a little bit. So and I remember this problem where you have an object, maybe your player, and you pick up something, and you go and you bring it with you, and then you go and leave it somewhere else, and you want it to follow something else instead. How do you typically do something like that in this framework?
You want to follow something else other than the player after it has left it, or what did you mean?
But basically the item or whatever, should be attached to different things. So you have the component as a child component, but then basically I want to move it to another parent. Is that something you can do, or how do you accomplish that?
Absolutely. That is that's one of the strong points of the component system. So you can just transfer components from one component to another. So you can, for example, you can if you have the game, if the game itself is like the world or the root of everything, then you can just say, okay, now the component should be in the world instead of on the player. Or you want to give the item to another player, then you can just transfer that component to the other player, and it's just you just write change parent, and it will swap over automatically.
All right, very cool. And do you also have things like say the camera, is that a component? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Right. So there is we have two camera systems currently, and one of them is experimental, and that is where the camera is a component. So that one allows for multiple cameras and things like having one extra camera zooming in at the world. If you look at, I think in the examples page, if it is up to date, it will have something called camera component, and it will showcase that. But the default camera is not a component currently, because it's quite complex to have multiple cameras and things like that. So, but we're working on it.
Thanks.
Right, we have what are the general benefits comparing with the HTML5 game engines? So the biggest benefit is that you will get native performance instead of through the browser performance if you write an app. And yeah, what more? I don't know. It's obviously a question of taste, but I like Dart a lot more than JavaScript, for example, where you have there's Dart is a like quite nice language compared to TypeScript and JavaScript, but that's obviously my opinion, and it's quite biased. How to create an interactive tutorial? Well, so you can. We're currently adding so that we can show, like, since you can run Flame games on web, we're gonna put Flame games inside of the docs, so you can see all of the features that we're explaining in the docs live there. But if you go into the tutorials page, that one is a bit interactive too. The tutorials.flameengine.org. Any more questions? It's very nice to see so many questions when you have a more like an audience that are in Sweden. Usually it's very quiet. I had a presentation on Sunday for for a Pakistan group, and then there were so many questions. Nobody is held back. It's the Swedish mentality of asking questions. Okay, I meant creating an interactive tutorial in my own game. Yeah, I mean, it would be, it's basically you can use your own game. You just, you can highlight buttons and stuff. You just have to, it will be part of the game if you do that. But you can also use Flutter, a layer of, on top of the game, which has these kind of things built in, so that it will, then you can put your game into a mode where you cannot interact with it directly, and then it puts this layer on top, and that one will highlight things and explain things with animations. I don't remember what that package is called though, but I think there are a few different ones like that. If you remember the name of the technique, you will find the name of the package too, but I have forgotten the name of the technique too.
I came up with another question.
Yeah.
Can you do, or is there support for doing like, having like vector graphic elements where you, that the body can change shape and stuff?
Yeah, so in some sense, you can transform an object, but we don't support skewing currently. But you can transform an object in other ways.
Yeah, but say that you have like a completely, I don't know, like a star or something, and then you want just one of the arms to extend, or I don't know, weird example, but like something really, really specific, and you really need a vector graphic to move a point or something.
Oh, okay. Oh, now I understand what you mean with vector graphics. Yeah. So there is we have a bridge package called Flame SVG too, but it doesn't have
answers it all.
Yeah, but like vector graphics, unfortunately, they don't perform very well on Flutter currently, and that is like a big issue that is being discussed, what kind of vector format they should support later. And they have talked about that for like 3 years, and it's a long infected discussion, but hopefully we'll get some nice vector graphic that are performance too. So, but for simple games, you can usually use SVGs anyways. But I have never tried to manipulate an SVG dynamically, but it should be possible.
Okay, cool.
Is there any good package to use sprite sheets? Yes, it is. It is built in for using sprite sheets to animations, and you can also put your sprite sheets into Fire Atlas, and Fire Atlas will generate something called an FA file. And that one will, you can use that one directly in your game, and it will have like the time between each step and things set up already. There are some in the examples. If you look at the animation, like sprite animation example, I think that one uses a sprite sheet. So you have not spent your time setting up sprite sheets in vain. They are still very, very useful inside of Flame.
I have never seen so many questions before. Good job, guys.
Yeah, love it.
Do we have any more, or should we wrap it up? I think we have had like, this is a record. It's so many questions, but that's a good sign.
Yeah, right.
Interesting subject for sure. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I want to say a big thank you to Lukas, taking his time talking about this and spreading the word and teaching us some new stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. And if you have any further questions, you can just like add me on Twitter, or just go into our Discord, which you can find on flameengine.org.